Welcome to the College Parent Central podcast. This is the podcast where we talk about just about everything we can think of that has to do with parenting a student who's in high school and thinking about college, a student who is in college, and sometimes a student who's about to step out of college, because it's a big job for us as parents. My name is Vicki Nelson, and I am a professor of communication at a small liberal arts college. But probably even more important, I am the mother of three daughters who have all gone to college and have come out on the other side, and we've all survived it. And I am here today with one of my co-hosts and with a special guest, and I'm very excited about this. I was I stumbled on something on the internet a little while ago, and it was this wonderful article about using Post-its to help students or help your kids learn about executive functioning. And it really struck a chord because I was thinking of two things. I was thinking of one of my grandsons who has ADHD and is in middle school, trying to get a handle on everything and how he's going to function, increasingly independently. And then I was also thinking of the college freshmen that I teach, who need a lot of help to figure out how to manage on their own. So this article just struck a chord for me. And then I was talking with Elizabeth, my co-host, whom I'm going to allow to get a word in edgewise and introduce herself in a minute. And she said, "Oh yes, I know Kelley Challen, who wrote the article. We work together." So then it was a done deal that we had to get Kelley on the podcast. So with that being said, I'm going to toss it over to Elizabeth Hamblet, my co-host, and let her take it from here.
Well, thanks, Vicki. I'm Elizabeth Hamblet. I am a college learning disability specialist and author of Seven Steps to Success, Seven Steps to College Success, a pathway for students with disabilities. And so I'm so delighted to have our guest here. And what Vicki has so kindly not mentioned is I've actually been nagging her about getting Kelley on this
That's true.
on the podcast. She's so polite.
I just didn't
Um,
connect the dots when I read the article that this was the same person you had been talking about. So,
because Kelley and I connected a few years ago through a professional experience, but I have since been devouring all of her writing. She is a really, really smart, thoughtful professional who is helping students with college transition and other kinds of transitions, as she will discuss. And executive functioning is certainly a huge part of what I help my students with at the college level. So I was just so tickled when Vicki emailed me and said, "Hey, I came across this post. This woman's name seems familiar to me." So finally, we have Kelley here on the podcast. So, with that, I'm going to let Kelley talk a little bit more about what she does, what a transition specialist is, and we'll take it from there.
Sure. Thank you so much, Vicki and Elizabeth, for having me here today. I'm really excited to be on and be able to talk with you both. I am Kelley Challen. I'm a transition specialist and the founder of Challen Education and Transition Services. And so I have the pleasure of working with teenagers and young adults, sort of anywhere between ages 12 all the way up to late 20s, which is an exciting period of time to get to work with young people. Many of the folks that I work with have disabilities or learning differences, and I get to work with them during K-12 education as well as afterwards, with the focus of really helping them move from high school into college, into employment, into more independent living or other post-secondary kinds of paths based on their own goals. A lot of my focus is planning beyond the IEP, but certainly not every student I work with has been on an IEP or has even been on a 504 plan. And I guess when I think about transition planning, it's helping to not just think about graduation. I think we can sort of focus on end of high school as a finish line that we're getting to. And what I try to really help students that I work with to focus on is readiness for the adult activities that come after that. It's setting the goals around the adult activities that come after that. I tend to really focus on three different buckets of planning. What are your independent living types of goals? And that can also have to do with how you engage in your community. What are your learning or training goals for after high school? And then what are you thinking about for working? And I talk a lot with students too about what's the first job you want to have, right? Not just what are your long-term
Mm.
goals around employment, but what's the very first thing you think you might want to get paid for? What could you see yourself doing? So it's really that living, learning, and working activities and that focus on preparing for life beyond high school. And I will do transition planning with obviously students in K-12 education, but you can transition plan as an individual from any point in your life, right? I mean, we could all sit here as adults who have careers and think, what do I want to be doing in my independent life? Do I want to do any more learning or training? You know, are there work activities I haven't gotten to take part in yet that would really be goals for me in the future? And so those areas of living and learning and working can be used to plan from any point in time an individual is at. Um, so that's me in a nutshell, and kind of the idea of transition planning. And I do conduct transition assessments and I do consultation. I do some coaching for students getting ready for college. I do some coaching for students who are planning to get out of college. But really, anything that I can do with students through that transition planning lens, I'm excited to do. And I certainly do a lot of professional development and training and speaking around that too.
And Kelley and I will be doing our first co-presenting gig next month, so we're very excited.
Yeah,
It's been a lot of fun working with her.
that's
It has.
great. And Kelly, you're I think about a step ahead of me because you've answered some of what question that I had, and I think it's really fascinating because, as you said, we all go through these transitions all the time, but I think so often we think about a transition as something that happens to us. It's certainly, we talk to the freshmen. I teach a lot of freshmen, and we say, this is a big transition for you. And but the idea of planning for transition, of feeling as though you have control over that transition is really very different than just sitting back and saying, "Ooh, this thing is going to happen. I wonder how it's going to go." So it's fascinating the work that you do. And I assume you work with the students who are going to be transitioning, but also with parents.
I do. I do. I work with parents a lot, and I provide a lot of parent consultation and preparation and coaching, and sort of especially help allowing students to set their own goals
Mm.
and thinking about the steps to reach those goals. And anytime I'm working with parents, I'm also very honest with them that my priority is always going to be the student's vision for themselves and how we can get to that, how we can understand students' goals. Students do not always have realistic goals for themselves, but I'm sure none of us did either when when we were teenagers. And I think whether you're a student who has disabilities or not, we need to create a sense of agency for students that it's okay to set a goal, try something, have that work or not work, but really be empowered to be in charge. And that's one of the biggest pieces of transition planning for students is that sense of agency, is that sense of control. And is helping the adults in the student's life to relinquish that control a little bit. So that's a big piece of the parent work.
Yeah. So, as a college learning disability specialist, that is, the specific population that I work with. And so, a lot of who Kelley works with are students with disabilities. And, what we see in the research is that, and anecdotally in my community of professionals, where other colleagues are writing in about the issues with students, some of what we're seeing is they are coming to college be accustomed to a lot of adult support and direction, and not a lot of agency, as you said, and independence. And so, part of what Kelly and I have been talking about too is, here's what I'm saying, here's what we're seeing on the college end, what could be happening at the high school, you know, end of this transition that would help. And I imagine that sometimes parents see students doing very well, certainly academically, perhaps, just in general, executive function wise, seemingly like things are pulled together because of the amounts of sometimes, invisible support that they're getting, structure in place. And when you talk to them about trying to pull back some of those supports, which I think is really important in truly assessing whether this student has the skills needed wherever they're going after high school. But that there's resistance, understandably, on parents' part because they see the student doing well. And in some cases, they've gotten to that place because from where the students were not doing well. And so the idea of taking away supports is terrifying. So how do you talk to them a little bit about their concerns that their student might, failure can mean a lot of different things and take a lot of different shapes, but how do you talk to them about it?
I, I think there is so much nuance in this topic. We could
Yeah.
probably spend the entire time together talking about this. I mean, I think one of the first places to come from with anyone you're working with, right? But certainly with parents, is validating that this is stressful, this is scary. And I think what's so hard about high school engagement when you're preparing for college is there are some stakes here, right? When a student is in high school and we're asking parents to start to scale back support or asking parents to ask teachers and other people to start to scale back support, there is a risk that students will struggle, right? There is a risk that a student may bomb a test or if they're working on getting up in the morning be late to school. There are risks about things that could affect the student's record, which then does affect their applications, and that is something that people are quite worried about. What I try to talk about a little bit is that there are even bigger risks to not scaling back and having the student head off to college or head off to other adult activities without having had the opportunity, right? We
Hmm.
talk a lot about where would you prefer a student to fail, right? Or a student to
Right.
struggle. And I think many parents would much prefer to be able to be there, be
Mm.
with their student, be able to support them, be able to reassure them.
Hmm.
If a student goes through some of that struggling at home, as opposed to in the dorm or as opposed to on the other side of the country. So I think it's just I'm a large believer in helping people to understand reality and what's realistic and sort of playing out different scenarios in terms of what happens if we don't scale back support now. And I think as you and I talk about often, there's also just sometimes misunderstandings about
Hmm.
what the future will look like and can look like in terms of levels of support. So there are certainly those conversations to have. But I think a piece of this strategy also is talking about what are the risks that you feel like you could let your child take, right? What are the small
Mm.
steps that you might be willing to let them take? Is it emailing a teacher when they've missed an assignment or when they need to get work before they're going to miss school for a medical appointment, right? Is it letting them manage scheduling one of their tutoring sessions or one of their appointments on their own? Are there things that they could allow the student to miss or forget comfortably, right? Maybe it's
Hmm.
not a midterm exam that maybe it is a homework assignment, or maybe there's a class where things are a little bit lower stakes that they feel like they could allow a student to start taking some more autonomy in. So I'm always looking for what's possible.
Hmm.
It's sort of when we're resistant to change, I'm always looking for, well, where is there wiggle room here? Where is there something you could be comfortable with as a parent? And where's your student motivated so they might actually be more successful with less support, and really sort of trying to find the easiest point of access and the easiest point for reducing some of those supports.
What strikes me as you're describing all of that is also um, not only letting that failure, if we call it that, happen while parents are there to support it, but once students go away to school, it may be happening and parents don't know about it. I
Oh,
mean,
for
so
sure.
many of the students that I see that have trouble, and parents are clueless. So getting that sort of heads up while they're home is even more important.
Well,
And
I was going to say, if I might, and Vicki, you and I, our most recent podcast together was about the vocabulary of the college
Yes.
disability services environment specifically, and the changes there. And so, part of that is understanding that they're not going to have the access, that the case managers do very different things. And so, as Kelley alluded to, they are expecting sometimes this level of attention to their student by adults, at the college, by staff and faculty that just isn't going to be there. And so was when Kelley was talking about, they have to schedule one of their learning specialists, understanding that college staff really isn't responsible, for instance, for chasing students. So when a student, the way that I get students where I work is an email goes out. Some students don't read their emails, they never see it. We do not send a follow-up email from my office. Once they respond to me, I go back to them and say, here are my available times. Sometimes that's where the communication trail ends. Or I hear from them 2 weeks later and they say, hey, do you have something tomorrow? And I have to say, no, I'm already booked. So the things that families are accustomed to are not things that we necessarily provide. And so I think talking to them about the exceptions that are being made, the flexibility that their students are getting, because I think sometimes that stuff is invisible.
absolutely. And I have, different checklists that I like to use. Elizabeth knows I sort of have one that I've put together over the years. It's just 31 must-have
It's
college
really
readiness
good.
skills. But there are lots of checklists on the internet, and
Hmm.
I'm a big believer in data. And what's interesting is if a parent and a student fill out something like that together, sometimes, it has the skills that we know are important for college success. And sometimes when they're filling those types of things out, they'll say, oh, well, he won't need to do that in college, right? And so it opens the door. Sometimes that alone helps parents to understand what's going to be expected. And then they have an aha moment in terms of what number of skills or what number of responsibilities a student needs to be learning and building. But sometimes it's really, there's a sense of disbelief there. And then the work is around learning more about what's realistic in college. And you get a sense of where to focus in. Which is just so important. There's a certain amount of psychoeducation that's part of this transition process, right? It's sort of learning about the realities of college, learning the vocabulary of college, and you can't be self-aware. You can't sort of know what to expect if you don't know what the realities are of
Yeah.
college.
When you have parents who say, well, oh, it doesn't matter that the college won't provide a learning specialist or an executive functioning coach or somebody to meet with my kid, 3 times a week. And but we can provide it, or I'll be that support for my student. How do you talk to them? And also, I'm curious about whether you get a gauge of the student's response to that. Where are students in all of this as their parents are, feeling understandably.
I I think students are all over the place in that, some students
Yeah, that's
would
fair.
be delightfully happy to have the same exact level of support that they have in high school for their entire adult lives. I'd be happy to have that level of support as an adult, right? I mean, I'd be happy to have somebody else hand me a schedule for the day, tell me what I'm cooking for dinner, right? Any of that. Um,
Fair.
so I think some students would be happy to have that. I think the reality is there is a lot that you can outsource. There is a lot that you could privately pay for when making this transition to college. But there's a lot that you cannot. And so, it's running through that exercise again of, okay, if you were going to pay for a support program as part of college, or if you're going to pay for a private executive function coach, what are the limits on what that person can do, and what the student still has to do? I mean, there are expectations that colleges have, right, systemically,
Right.
in terms of what students will be responsible for themselves. There are ethics codes in terms of what students need to actually do on their own. So again, it goes to some of that, information. I mean, I think external supports can help, but they can't replace internal skill, right? You can't outsource ownership over the college process, and it's not successful to do that because a student who requires a really high amount of, a student who's going to require tutoring and academic coaching and is going to be spending a significant number of hours per day using supports so that they can manage the academics of college has an enormous amount of work ahead of them,
Mm,
right? And is going to need an enormous amount of grit to get through that. And there are students I work with who are very much up for that. And it's incredible, right? And we talk about those students actually being able to manage, the college experience 4 or 5 classes at a time with all of that support. They will miss some of the social life of college. They may miss some of the important networking that would be helpful for employment later, but they're up for it. And so, as long as everyone's on the same page about the amount of work it's going to take and the amount of resources, financial, emotional, time resources that it will take, that's something that could be part of a plan for a student. But students and parents also need to understand what a student's giving up, and if a parent says they're going to do it themselves, I think the risk there, as opposed to a paid provider who understands the college system, is that often parents don't understand the college system, don't understand, what would I need my student to actually give me access to make sure they were turning in their work, to make sure they were attending their classes. So I think it's a big risk when a parent thinks they're going to be the support for the
mm,
transition, if they're trying to keep that in place. Uh, it's an enormous cost, if they're expecting other people to do it. I mean, I think there's always a benefit to reducing support to whatever extent is possible in high school and increasing autonomy to whatever extent is possible in high school. And that does look different for different students. And then there are all different kinds of colleges that students can attend. There are some things that colleges just absolutely cannot do, but there is flexibility, from one college to another in terms of how small and how supportive and how personal the relationships are and things like that.
It really makes me wonder if a student needs that high level of all of these sports in college, what happens to them after college? What, are parents going to continue to hire coaches who are going to be able to go to work with the student? And I mean, it just at some point it seems they have to launch.
Yes, and at some point there, I mean, there has to be internal motivation there. It's also there's this piece of when we overfunction and overhelp students, we're implicitly sending a bit of a message that we don't
Mhm.
believe they can do it, or that we
Mhm.
don't believe they, have the, and there's a difference between not having learned to do something yet, or not having a good executive function system for being able to do something consistently yet,
Mhm.
and just really not being capable, right? And I think sometimes it's not recognized that adults are sending that message, or that a student is internalizing that message, even if that's not
Yes.
what's intending to be sent. And that's a really high risk then, Vicki, for a student thinking they need. Right. I can't possibly do a job unless I have a coach, 5 hours a week who's going to
Mhm.
process with me at the end of the day or go to the job site with me. And we really, I think students are capable of a lot more, but haven't had the opportunities to
Mhm.
plan and problem solve and initiate and structure for themselves yet.
And Kelly, I would assume that you also interact with like whatever it's called in everybody's state, the Department of Vocational Rehab, which for students, and it varies from state to state, may be eligible for, from some supports from DVR, either for college or to go into a job site. But I think it's not as many students as perhaps parents would like to see receiving support. And I'm so glad that you said that about, students' sense of self-efficacies too, and the messages that they're internalizing because, um, right, until they've been given a chance to try something, we don't know what they're capable of doing. And, it doesn't mean that you just, shove them off the ledge and hope that they fly, but starting to model for your students what you're, being explicit in your everyday life with them about what you are doing, how you are supporting them, you know, turning over control and mastery of this stuff to them, and understanding and being patient with the fact that it won't always work out as you've said. Sometimes they're going to miss an appointment. I miss appointments and I'm a really good executive functioner. But that is life. And also, so that resilience piece too. This idea that they can never, ever experience any kind of even, tiny, tiny failure, I think doesn't allow them the opportunity to see that they'll make it through. It will be a bummer, and they might have to apologize. They might have to inconvenience themselves to make something up, but that they can do it. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, but I think that competence builds confidence. And when they finally see that they can do the things that others have been doing for them, to your point, yes, some of them would be delighted to always have somebody around, but I do worry about that anxiety that some of them might go to college with, that they have never been able to be successful without a whole lot of adult help.
I think we have, I mean, I know, right? We know now through research that this is more of a complication for many teenagers,
Hmm.
is having that anxiety and that worry that they can't do things on their own, and having had those fewer problem solving opportunities and being a little bit more reliant on parents in particular. It's a generation that is much more connected with their parents, and there are wonderful positives to that. But
Hmm.
college is absolutely a system that expects students to be somewhat individuated from their parents. And as we were talking about before a little bit, I mean, there are certain things you can do for a college student, and there are certain things you cannot. I cannot register for my child with disability support services.
Correct.
Right? I can't show up to the tutoring session for them.
Right.
So there are just certain things that you can't pay for, you can't do for.
Hmm.
And we want students to know they can do it, and they can miss an appointment, and that's okay. They can reschedule it, not
Hmm.
always as quickly as they want to, but really wanting students to know that they have those abilities and that they have some problem solving systems on their own. I had a parent I was working with not that long ago, who really wanted to know like which life skills are the very most important life skills to start with.
Hmm.
And my answer was that really it's the what do you do when you don't know the life skill? Is it that the student knows that they are comfortable looking things up on YouTube when they need to learn how to problem solve something new? Is it that they're comfortable using an AI chatbot to help them, create a task analysis to be able to do a task? What is it that a student can do when they hit the one skill that they didn't learn how to do, whether
Hmm.
that's writing a check, which we do so infrequently that we all sort of forget how to do it at this
Addressing an
Yeah.
but
envelope.
it happens sometimes.
Yeah.
So I think there are so many skills that are important to learn because they make you feel that confidence and competence as you're making transitions. And then knowing that you have some ability to problem solve when you hit a new skill, because we all do in life, is also really critical for young people. So, yeah.
That that skill of asking questions and asking for help. So many students, uh, all kinds of students, executive function or not, just don't ask for help, and they it seems as though they have this feeling that being independent means you have to do everything yourself, and you can't rely or ask other people. So you're talking, a lot about the things that they can't do and how to help them. What are there a couple of things that you find many students struggle with? What are the kinds of things that really might encounter as a roadblock?
I mean, I certainly think waking up on their own, as basic as that sounds,
Hmm.
is something that very few students really do nowadays. Some of my students, it's like they know how to set the alarm, but then there's still a parent prompt somewhere in that routine
Hmm.
before they're making it out the door. And again, I understand that often, high school starts at hours that are not, not really humanly appreciative of where where adolescents are and how much sleep they need. But
We
it's
have an
it's an
episode with Lisa about teens and sleep, don't
Hmm.
we?
yeah,
Hmm.
but that's an important skill. I mean, laundry is a funny one that students just haven't always done. And I think I had heard a different, I don't know if it was something I read on the internet or a different episode. It was talking about a student who hadn't learned to change their bed sheets. And so
Oh,
the parent was planning to allow them to just put 6 sets of bed sheets on their bed, like one on top of another, take one set of sheets off per
wow.
week. And then in six
Wow.
weeks, the parent would come up and do the laundry and,
That
rechange those
seems
six
extreme.
sheets. Well, and it's interesting. I think you can see it from either perspective, and that's what's amazing, right? You could say that's extreme. Like, why can't this kid just learn this skill? Or you
Hmm.
could say, is that the hill, that you want to die on? Is that, and
Right.
I think there's a picking and choosing for each student of
Hmm.
which skills are more important. I tend to think if a student's going to be far away from home, laundry is a really important skill, and students
Hmm.
seem to not be getting as much exposure to that. Medication management is a big one. If you happen to be somebody who needs medication,
Hmm.
especially for attention or mood or other
Right.
things, making sure that students really, and it's not just, can I take my medications every day, but do I know what to do when it needs refilling?
Hmm.
And some of that could be done automatically, but sometimes it's not a perfect system. So, really, students managing that can be critical.
But that sheet example is such a good one because first of all, I mean, we don't know anything about the family. Did the family try to teach the student how, explicitly how to change their sheets? And if not, I still every once in a while look on YouTube for a better ironing strategy, and I realize college students are not ironing, but in other words, that is a strat like
Yeah.
here are the number of sheets we're going to provide you with. We think it's a good idea for you to wash them regularly and like that's seeking out of help. That it's self-advocacy, right? I'm
Right.
struggling with this. Maybe I could get on the internet and find somebody to help me do it because what I also think about is like maybe the roommate sees them do that. And
Yeah.
maybe there's a sense of embarrassment by the student with the 6 sets of sheets that they haven't learned to do. Now, again, I don't assume anything, but I think we're leaving out that piece of the confidence and, just even the social acceptability of not being able to do certain things that perhaps they might have if they'd had a chance to
Mhm.
try and had some instruction.
Well, and I realize I focused on life skills because I think those are sometimes forgotten, but there are certainly, academic things that like
Sure.
students are just not used to managing
Right.
some of the deadlines or long-term assignments in the way that you need to in college,
Hmm.
volume of work. I mean, there are surprises because the systems are quite different. And I think
Hmm.
when you think about transitioning to college, you're making a lot of learning and a lot of living changes all at the same time. So
Hmm.
anything that can be done to front load being used to, to more in either one of those buckets is really helpful in terms of managing that transition. And the social piece that you're mentioning, right? College is a weird social system. It's, living with a bunch of adolescents is
Hmm.
such a unique experience. And there are lots of things that can come up. And certainly, if you're someone who's not comfortable advocating or asking for help, right, there are
Hmm.
so many risks or just discomforts that can come along with that. So I think it's just really needing to appreciate the number of variables that are changing and whatever we can do to help students prepare for that number of variables. And when you were talking about self-advocacy and asking for help, Vicki, I just kept thinking, I almost think that asking for help is a phobia for, 18-year-olds today, the way that public speaking is for most people, and we're all sitting here on a podcast, so I'm assuming we're pretty comfortable talking, but it's because we've spent a lot of time practicing talking in front of other people and
Hmm.
to other people. And the number of opportunities a 17 or an 18-year-old has had today where they actually had to ask for help, actively ask for help, ask a
Hmm.
stranger for help, even getting to be, asking, customer service for help in a store. I mean,
Hmm.
there's so many fewer opportunities to practice that. So we do need to like push those opportunities in for students earlier if we want them to feel even remotely comfortable doing that when they're in a college system.
Well, I was just saying, and just when it comes again to students with disabilities, very often I hear stories about students, sitting down and working with a specialist or a tutor who makes them do their homework and who is there at every moment to, to answer questions. And that is taking away their ability to, self-motivate and organize and to figure out how to assess whether they've understood what they're working on and frame a question. And then all the parts about when is help available, office hours. Okay, my professor is available when I'm in class. What am I going to, does that mean it's over? I'm done. I failed the class. Or do I email the professor to say, gee, Professor Nelson, you're available when I'm not. Can you help me with this? And those are all things that they'll feel more comfortable doing if they have practice.
So, I mean, we probably should wrap up soon, but we said before we started that we could keep going and going. Um, if a parent perhaps has not gone to college themselves or went to college a long time ago, and college is a
Before the
little
internet.
different now. So I saw a little thing of a professor who just did something with his students where he gave them each a question and they had to find the answer not using their phones. They had to go to the library to find the answer, and they didn't know how to do anything. But if a parent doesn't have that experience, how how would you suggest they begin to think about what it is that their student needs to practice?
I think what's wonderful is that that parent does have a cell phone. And we have so many aside from like I just keep thinking of like Animal House and like, weird college movies, but we have so many other types of media these days to learn
Mhm.
about what college is actually like.
Hmm.
So certainly, for all parents, I know Elizabeth is also a fan. I'm a huge fan of The Naked Roommate by Harlan
Mhm.
Cohen, and he has a first year experience that he's doing with students. And I think what's great is that Harlan is constantly interviewing students, interviewing people in education, updating that resource. And so that ends up being a great resource for parents to read through, for for students to do the audio version of, to just learn about like what is college really like, what are some of the challenges that really come up. For students, if you're parenting a student with learning disabilities or diagnoses, somebody who's going to need disability services in college, I always recommend Elizabeth's book, right? I think that Seven Steps to College, like, it's the same thing. You have done such a nice job of making sure that it's got current research, that it has information from many different perspectives on disability support, but also that you've covered all of the details of the process. I mean, there's a chapter on everything in your book in terms of really understanding what reality is going to be for students transitioning to college with learning disabilities. So I think there are those great book resources. There are also, and I guess I should add some like caution tape around this, but there are also wonderful parent communities online where parents are talking about their current experiences, whether that's, parents of typically developing, or there's lots of wonderful information that you can get on what college realistically looks like right now. It's also, I mean, you can start. I don't think as a parent, I want necessarily like eighth graders going on college tours. They could, but we don't want to pour the pressure on super early. But as a parent, like you could go on a college tour and just get a sense of what college is, like at this point, if that's not something that you were exposed to or that you were exposed to recently. You can do all sorts of college tours virtually online these days. So I think it's really just taking time, not that any of us have time as parents, but taking a little bit of time to think about, okay, I want to make sure that I understand what college is like so that I can then help my child
Mhm.
really understand what college is like and where those stumbling blocks might be. It is quite different, right? The electronic systems are quite different. Social life of young people is quite different. The things that were risks 40 years ago on a college campus are quite different than the things that are risks right now on a college campus. And there are a lot of wonderful first year college coaches and first year transition kinds of people, and it's wise to at least go to some of their workshops and hear about what they notice are some of the biggest challenges for students, because there are some really universal things that are challenging or complicated about this transition. And so I think you can learn a lot, just listening to a 45-minute podcast or going to a 60-minute webinar. And I guess I didn't say this, Vicki, but certainly if someone's listening to this podcast, listen to more College Parent Central podcasts,
Yeah.
because
I
there's
was
a
going
lot
to
of
get
great.
that in, so thank you.
Oh my
Yeah,
gosh. And the,
yeah,
decade worth of
absolutely.
wonderful written posts that Vicki has
Yeah,
has
we've
been
got a
putting
lot of it,
together.
and that really was
Really,
was
really good
was how we
information.
started.
Yes.
Is just saying, I remember when my first child went off to college, and I was overwhelmed with trying to make sense of it all. And I work in higher education, so I said, if I don't get it, then there must be other people who need it. So yes, thank you. We've just I think this may be episode 152 or something. So we've just hit that 150 mark in
Amazing.
terms of podcast episodes. So we got a lot out there.
Well, and something that I loved, Vicki, we're talking a lot about transition to college, but you had a wonderful episode of College Parent Central that was the transitioning back to the second semester.
Mm,
And we don't think about that. We think about how hard that
Hmm.
that first semester
yeah,
is, and there are all sorts of other pains about going back after the holidays. And
right.
so I really think, again, as a parent, you do not know what you don't know. As a high school student, you really have no idea what to expect from the transition. And so the fact that you guys have spent so much time meeting with different experts, talking about different, aspects of college, that it's just a wonderful resource for students and families.
And so are you. So what would you leave parents with? What would be your bottom line if you could give one overall uh, piece of advice to parents?
So, I guess the one piece of advice to think about is that if a student doesn't feel completely ready to make the college transition, at the end of 12th grade, that's okay. You know, it's okay to take a step in a different direction. What's wonderful is gap year experiences have become more normalized. And what we know is when students take a gap year, they're more successful when they end up progressing on to college after that. There are different ways to do college in terms of starting at community college. That's even a really wonderfully more affordable option these days because some states have free community college access, and sometimes community colleges have agreements with four-year colleges to transfer. So I think, you know, if college feels really important in your student's future, and especially if it's important to your student, I just think it's important to know that college isn't done in a one size fits all way.
Mm.
There are lots of ways to do college. And if you're worried because it doesn't seem like your child's going to be able to make the transition to college in the traditional way, that's totally fine.
Really good. That's great advice. And more students are doing it in different ways. Some are on the 5-year plan, and they just need to go a little more slowly too.
The 5 or the
S-
6 year.
Yeah, well, there you go.
Yeah.
I think the National Center for Edge Statistics only tracks 6 and 8 year
Yep.
completion rates. I don't think they even bother with 4 years.
Yeah,
4 year completion's a little bit less than 50%, and 6 year completion's a little bit less than 70% in terms of
Mhm.
students who enroll as first time. So I think it's just, it's okay if it doesn't look
yeah,
the way that we think it was supposed to
yeah.
look. There's lots of ways to do it.
So if people would like to hear more from you, read more of these wonderful articles, or check in, how can they find you?
Yeah. So I do have a website. It's just www.challen transitions.com, spelled Challen transitions.com. I certainly would love it if people look on Substack for my Planning Beyond the IEP
So
newsletter.
good. So
I
good.
try to put out things that are really current and important to students and families there. And I'm easily available on social media, you know, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. They're all basically at Kelley, Kelley, Challen Transitions. And I'm super Googleable to make up a new word. You know, if you heard this podcast and you were driving and the only 3 words you remember are Kelley, Challen, Transition, I am certain you can find me through that type of Google search.
Okay. And we will put all of that in the show notes, and so people can follow there. Well,
Great.
thank you so much for taking time to talk to us, to talk to everybody who's listening. Um, Lots we can do to help our students get ready.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Vicki, for finding me through that was a Planning Beyond the IEP Substack that you ended up reading about the post-it.
Yeah,
So I'm glad you found me, and I really appreciate being
me
invited
too.
to join you guys.
Thanks again. And to everybody, thank you for staying with us to the end and to listening, and we'll see you next time.